The movie begins when a group of elite astronauts on a mission experiences a malfunction while entering Earth's stratosphere. The Earth became uninhabitable after a global catastrophe that nearly wiped out humanity on Earth, and the ruling elite escaped to settle on Kepler's 209 space colony. The utmost burden on the planet ceased. It started healing itself. After surviving 2 generations on Kepler 209, they started the Ulysses project to determine whether a return to Earth is possible. A team was assembled to return to Earth but was lost shortly after landing, labeled as Ulysses 1. Ulysses 2 was set into action with a group of young astronauts. A young female astronaut named Blake returns to Earth with fellow astronauts Tucker and Holden. Their space capsules land more or less on a mudflat close to the Henderson hub, a ride-out bathe that broadcasts telemetry data back to Kepler 209 and sinks immediately. Holden didn't make it, Tucker was severely injured, and Blake was slightly wounded. The Earth was free from radiation and didn't cause any radiological damage, which is the first sign the Earth is habitable. To report back to Kepler, Blake moved out of the mud to initiate the first recon to get more data to check their fertility, which caused a dent in Kepler due to its excessive radiation. The next tide comes in 6 hours, so they have to gather their data in that time window. Blake goes out to scout the area. She finds some animals. The space capsules Tucker was left in after they crashed are now obscured by fog. When Blake decided to stroll back to the space capsule, she and Tucker, who was severely injured, were winded and captured in the capsule by a gang of fertile humans known as the Muds. The Muds confine Blake and Tucker within a pit cell where they are deprived of food, water, and medical care. In the Mud settlements, Blake was summoned to attend to a wounded male, also a Mud, looking for her medical equipment. Blake, with some other Muds, headed back to the space capsules for the medical equipment, and Blake noticed the Muds had damaged every transmitting system and panel in the space capsule. Blake was returned to the pit cell after treating the wounded Mud. Tucker begins to fade out due to excessive blood loss and commits suicide. He thinks he will slow Blake down and follows the base order, which states that whenever they pose a threat to the mission, they should end their lives by taking a pill or using various means, leaving Blake alone to carry out the task. With water rushing into the well caused by tides and frequent floods, Blake almost drowned, but a helper came to her aid and was saved by a girl named Mila. In a flashback, the ruling elite left some weather stations around before leaving the Earth, and one of those stations signaled the potential for human life again. That's why they've sent the mission that Blake's father led to Kepler. Unfortunately, due to the local radiation, they can't have babies. The Muds were then invaded by an unfriendly group that came to kidnap all of them, leaving behind Mila's mom, Narvik, Blake, and a couple of other children. The Muds are taken to a loading ship that rises above the habituated floods and storms. Worried for her daughter, Narvik went after the cargo ship, hoping to save Mila. Blake went ahead, following Narvik to help. Narvik wants to use a flare gun at them, but Blake tries to stop as it reveals their location. As Narvik doesn't seem to listen, Blake knocks her out in a brawl. Blake could sneak onto that cargo ship and mingle with the other captured Muds by distracting the group with a flare shot in the air. On getting to the group settlement, the hostages were separated by splitting into different working spaces by a man called Pauling, a Mud who works out what's best for him and now working with the invaders. As a shock, Pauling introduces Blake to a man named Gibson, a Kepler astronaut and a survivor of the first mission led by Blake's father. They thought they had no survivors as their space capsule was destroyed along with its communication equipment upon returning to Earth. Gibson claims the Muds rebelled when he and crew were waiting for the next communication window to send the report to Kepler and, in the process, destroyed Ulysses 1 and killed Blake's father. Explaining to Gibson how her team crossed and had a malfunction after entering the stratosphere, Blake mentions she possesses a device called the biometer, an instrument developed by Kepler to measure biochemical change, and it specializes in fertility. Gibson asked if the biometer could transmit, and Blake responded, the biometer can only share when connected to the Ulysses 1's transmitters. Gibson introduces Blake to his adopted son Neil and partner Moonai. He claims to have saved Moonai and her son from inevitable deaths in the ocean. While Kepler's reproductive technology efforts failed for both man and woman, Gibson proposes bringing the settlements in Kepler to Earth to realize Blake's father's vision. Blake was shown to a room by Pauling, and she cried in agony about the bad news she heard of her dad from Gibson. She comforted herself by repeatedly reciting a word they say in Kepler, for the many. Having a shower, Blake realizes she is fertile when she sees her period, and she meets with the analogy of the Muds, whom Gibson is educating. Mila is introduced to the class to learn. The children were reasonable in asking Blake questions about Kepler while answering, and she was focused on Mila to see if she was okay. Blake left the class after tending to the children's questions and came across Neil. While chatting with him, Blake learns that her father, Christopher, was locked because he sided with the Mudds. Blake started to look for her father and did find him. Still, Blake is stopped by Gibson, who claims Christopher is being locked up with claims that her father led the Mudds' rebellion because he fell in love with a Mudd woman. Still, Blake learns that he had been locked away because he sided with the Mudds, believing that Kepler's occupant should never return to Earth. After a brief emotional reunion with her dad, Christopher tries to convince Blake to stop her plans to bring Kepler settlements to Earth, because he knows that the blue moon of exploiting would come up again after their entrance, leading to more destruction and wreckage. There was no end to elite human greed. He soon realized that the planet could only sustain human needs, not their desire, but all his effort to convince her were ineffective. Gibson continually poisons Blake's thoughts. Blake, Gibson, Moon Eye, and Neil are having dinner and discussing when the power went off due to an intrusion. In the process, Narvik attacks Gibson's stronghold to retrieve her daughter, taking out the guards on standby guarding the generator. Wandering in the dark, Blake was attacked by Narvik, who had already found her way to the settlements in search of Mila. Blake, at a knife point, leads Narvik to where Mila and the children are being held. Gibson's men capture Narvik, and Blake discovers that only the girls are being held captive for Gibson's future breeding plans for the coming residents of Kepler, by creating a diverse and vigorous gene pool that Kepler's men would inculcate to repopulate the planet. She realizes that Gibson and the other elite humans are trying to create dominance. It wasn't an operation or job for survival but to maintain their superiority. At that instance, Blake realized that her father was right. In search of a missing biometer by Pauling and Gibson that will be connected to the Henderson Hub weather station to communicate with the Keplers, they realize Mila has been missing since the capture of Narvik. Pauling stops in Blake's quarter to search for the missing girl but intends to explore her, and a fight breaks out between the two, and Blake kills him by poisoning him with a poison pill in her mouth when she kisses him. With Narvik set to be executed by dawn and Blake coming to see the explicit purpose of Gibson's plan to use girls as test subjects for the incoming Kepler settlements. She sides with the Mudds, attacks the guards and releases the girls and their families. Blake and Narvik go ahead to release the captured Mudds, and they are headed to the ship. After freeing the Mudds, Blake goes to free her father. She notices Gibson moving toward the Henderson Hub with Neil and Moon Eye. Gibson found the biometer isolated in Mila's doll, which was what his adopted son Neil was playing with. Gibson is headed towards the Henderson Hub weather station to report to Kepler that they can procreate on Earth with Neil as a subject to prove that. Gibson knew that Neil was Blake's father's progeny, thus a considerable validation to prove that Keplers can produce offspring on Earth. Neil was Kepler born on Earth. When Blake's father returned to Earth, he experienced recovery advancement. He even got back his fertility and conjugal, a Mudd woman, who gave birth to Neil. Notwithstanding, he didn't even contact the Keplers because he already knew what would happen with the elite's intent to gain power and dominance over the Mudds and other Earth survivors, which led to his rebellion against Gibson. Blake learns that Gibson's adoptive son Neil is her half-brother, after her father impregnated Neil's mother. Blake arrived at the Henderson Hub weather station after Gibson but a bit later. Gibson holds Neil and his mother hostage and threatens to kill the boy if Blake doesn't put down her gun. Gibson also claims that Neil is her brother and a member of her flesh and blood. When she puts the pistol down, Gibson shoots Neil's mother, who then falls lifeless into the water. Blake tries to prevent the news from Earth from being transmitted back to Kepler 209 as he starts the transmission, but Gibson is able to send the data to the spacecraft successfully. As a result, when the elite receives the transmission message, they will depart for Earth. In curiosity, Blake pushes Gibson into the ocean, and the two combat, and Blake strangles and drowns Gibson underwater, thus leading to his death. Almost drowning herself, Narvik pulled Blake out of the water and saved her life. She was reunited with her father, brother, and extended Mudd family. Blake comforted a grieving Neil, who had just lost his mother. She handed over her father's souvenir, a matchbox with pictures of the first astronauts who landed on the moon. Neil also aspired to become an astronaut, thus, the souvenir motivated him to believe in his dreams. However, in the end, Neil asked the most curious question: are the Keplers coming? How many? Will they bring some trees? Blake suggested that they might all return. She doesn't say it with assurance because Gibson has relayed the information. The Kepler elites can decide how it would be received and what action they would take. However, she made it plain that the entire colony would return if they decided to do so because, on Kepler, humanity would not survive without fertility. They would therefore be forced to accept a considerable risk. Because Blake's father thought it would be impossible for a sapling to grow on Kepler 209, she lied about Kepler bringing trees with them. The last frame depicts Mud girls and other captured Muds returning to their families. Their families celebrated the reunion. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to watch more videos like this.